All right, welcome to session 4 of Making Sense of the Siddur at Beidam. Once again, I'm Rabbi Phil Bressler. Thanks all so much for coming this evening. And we're moving on to a session that'll help us complete our survey of the weekday Shaharit service in terms of analysis according to its prayer rubrics. And I did want to make one quick note that I think I'll save for the end because I want to make sure we get. I think I may save it for next week. But at some point, I want to make a note about differences in between different matbeas, different orders of the service between Jewish ethnic groups. So differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and the Hasidim do something different and weird, but call it Sephardi. It's very strange. I can give you a pretty succinct breakdown, but I think I'll actually save that for next week. But do know that the more we get away from those core pieces of the Amidah and the Shema and her blessings, the more variation you're going to get if you switch to a different, what they call nusach, a different tradition, basically. As you might expect, things evolved in different ways in different places. So what we use here is Nusach Ashkenaz, specifically Nusach Polin, the one from Poland and Lithuania, but I'll explain what that all means another time. Okay. So we'll go to the board real quick. I've laid out once again the 7 major rubrics of the weekday Shaharit service. We've covered already these 2 in the middle, Shema and its blessings, and the Amidah in some detail. And we're not going to cover as a matter of detail. Oh, someone's here. We're not going to cover in a tremendous amount of detail. What I have here is marked as silent prayer, partially because it's silent and it's deliberately supposed to be something made up. Of course, in the grand rabbinic tradition of writing down all the things that are supposed to be spontaneous, there is in fact something written for that. It's called Tachanun. It is actually really interesting, but also fairly difficult, and it's generally speaking skipped by a lot of congregations, precisely for those reasons that it's difficult. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there, except to note that it's a bridge in between Amidah and really, attached to Amidah because it's, our individual prayers as we're, still, in some sense in God's presence. We'll go over the Torah service a little bit in some more detail, although we're also going to save that. It has its own characteristics, but I think it's less interesting from the standpoint of how you can get more out of prayer to go into detail there. I mean, the primary focus of the Torah service is the Torah reading. I can't really explain that much better on one foot here. But the parts we're going to look at today are these first 2, Birkot HaShachar, the morning blessings, Pesukei De-Zimrah, part of the ramp up, the warm up, and also concluding prayers, which doesn't have as catchy a title, and maybe catch your thoughts later on why you think that might be. Okay. So, like anything worthwhile and like any kind of practice, prayer requires preparation. No serious athlete goes to play their sport without some kind of period of warming up, stretching, things like that. No serious musician starts to play their instrument, even just for practice, without doing some sort of warm up to loosen their fingers, loosen their voice. So too, in the same way, prayer, which is really supposed to be a daily practice, something that you repeat and get better at, requires some amount of preparation. And I'll call your attention first off to the source sheets, which I've prepared just 2 sources today, but the first one is relevant here. The Mishnah from Brachot, the 5th chapter of Brachot, which is the very first tractate of the Mishnah. So we're 5 chapters into the first tractate. They put this right up front in both Mishnah and Gemara. But we read here, this is, they've just finished laying out sort of the setup of the Shemona Esrei, as they call it, the 18, the Tefillah prayer, as it existed in roughly the 2nd century CE. When we read, one should not stand up to say Tefillah except in a reverent state of mind, literally koved rosh, literally a heavy head, as opposed to a light head, something kind of a sort of frivolous state of mind. You should be serious. The pious ones of old used to wait an hour before praying in order that they might direct their thoughts to God. And note here, if you're a Hebrew reader, the word for direct their thoughts is yichavnu et libam lamakom. So they shall they should incline their hearts, literally, because they used to think that the heart was the seat of thought as opposed to the brain. They'll incline or angle their hearts towards lamakom, towards God. That root is exactly the one we've been using to talk about intention, kavanah, and it's used here. So it's in order that they should have good kavanah. They should be concentrating on God. All the more so, and this is specifically about the Amidah, about tefillah. Even if a king greets a person while they're praying, who wouldn't want to stop and greet the king? I mean, that's like a big deal, and potentially there could be serious consequences if you don't return the greeting. Even if the king greets you while praying, one should not answer. Even if a snake is round one's heel, they should not stop. Pointing to the kind of degree of focus that they're trying to get to, where you could even ignore the snake around your heel. That's how focused on prayer they think you ought to be. I don't think it's wise to sort of overread the seriousness of this. I think there's clearly other values at work here, but that's what we're trying to get to. And how long did they take? An hour. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a lot that goes on during the day. Even if trying to pray 3 times a day, taking an hour out of my day for each one of those prayer services is a lot of time. Before even getting to Shema and Amidah, I'm supposed to spend an hour already preparing. It's pretty intense, as I like to say to kids that I teach this to. There was nothing on the internet, there was nothing on TV to distract them. They had a lot of time to sit and prepare to pray. But this feeling of, and so obviously, we don't literally take an hour, but the idea is to spend time preparing to pray before we really pray. And I brought this to illustrate that, the feeling of needing to clear one's mind, to need some kind of preparation for a service has always accompanied Jewish worship. And the result is, we'll see as we walk through some of these 2 preparatory rubrics, it's resulted in more and more additions to the service, preliminary to what's the required parts. We talk about Shema Amidah, seen as now obligatory. The warm-up acts there have been more and more artists added to the lineup as things have gone on, because as opposed to the required parts, very little agreement about how to prepare exactly. And I think there's some element of both wanting to chart a best way forward, something that tried and true path that we know works, and also allow flexibility for people to find what works for them. And you'll find that's frequently the case. Certainly here at Beinam, we pick and choose out of Pesukei De-Zimrah a lot. So then you'll notice that the Sim Shalom prayer books we have in front of us doesn't have, that I really like about that Koran edition that I had, is in the back of the Orthodox Koran Siddur. They have some pages about Hilchot Tefillah, the laws of prayer. And one of the things it has for Pesukei De-Zimrah, for example, is if you're short on time, here's how you should abridge your Pesukei De-Zimrah. Like, say you showed up late for whatever reason, we want you to get caught up to the service in time to do Shema and Amidah with the rest of the community. Here's how you can catch up. If you have enough time, you do this, 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 this. If you have a little less time, you do this, 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 and this. If you have even less time, you just do this and this. And the assumption is you'll come back and get the rest on your own time later, basically. So there's definitely a hierarchy here that I'll touch on a little bit in terms of pieces that are core to the experience and pieces that are a little bit more ancillary. But we're going to go through these rubrics, and I've made you outlines for them. Folks watching at home, I don't think I've shared the outlines yet, but before this goes up as a recording, I'll make sure to post them in the comments for this video. So I've made some rubric outlines that'll make it easy to follow along, including page numbers in the weekday Sim Shalom, the thicker copy of the Siddur. Okay. So like I said, different communities, different traditions about how to prepare for prayer. So without this kind of framework, this is, I think, is some of the easiest part to get lost in. It really seems like this kind of haphazard collection of psalms and blessings and biblical readings just sort of thrown together. It's really, really hard to get any sort of sense of what's going on here without this kind of top-down analysis. Okay. So 2 major rubrics leading up to Shema. The first, Birkot HaShachar, actually came later. So interestingly, even though Amidah is a little bit further in, the temporal order of creation here goes back to front towards the beginning. So Amidah came first, Shema nearly about the same time. Pesukei De-Zimrah sort of came together as a collection before Pesukei De-Zimrah, if that makes sense, or before Birkot HaShachar, if that makes sense. So Birkot HaShachar means literally the morning blessings. These were incorporated in the synagogue service later because they were originally intended to be said at home for individuals. And they were eventually incorporated into the synagogue service, basically to make sure that everyone said them. Yeah. Pesukei De-Zimrah, on the other hand, became part of the regular service first. And what's really notable about Pesukei is it's got a very different style, very different tone than the rest of the service, than especially Shema and Amidah. The language, if you don't like Psalms language that's like really extravagant, poetic, kind of almost over the top, you're not going to necessarily get a lot out of Pesukei De-Zimrah because that's what they bring. They kind of pick the most over the top, extravagant, psalms and pieces of liturgy for the section, and we'll see, as it comes together, why that might be. Also, the material in it was added at different times in different places, and it sort of creates this product with a less strict logic. And we sort of charted a pretty clear through line to the Amidah. Like we were saying, a little bit of debate about exactly how to categorize, but there's definitely a through line. And with Shema and its blessings, definitely, a pretty clear logic. There's less of that here. It's more, I would say, more like a representational art than, or maybe abstractly representational art than trying to really, draw something clear, like a very, discrete kind of logic. So you'll sort of get that. The forms are a little bit more free, more exuberant style, all that. Okay, let's jump in. So if you're following along with your rubrics, we'll start with Birkot HaShachar, and if you're following in a Sim Shalom Siddur, we're going to start on page 2. And if you're following along at home, and you're going to click that link to the Sefaria page that has the Birkot HaShachar for the weekday Shaharit service, you'll just do your best to keep up as we go along. I will try my best to refer to paragraphs by their first Hebrew word so that you can follow along there as well. Okay. So this section is called Birkot HaShachar, but that's not actually where it starts. On my chart, I sort of broken down the large rubric into several smaller rubrics. So the sort of first mini rubric inside of Birkot HaShachar, I titled Preparation. It leads up to the blessings themselves. And the most useful thing to imagine and the most useful way to make sense out of this is imagine waking up. Imagine getting out of bed. Like, picture yourself this morning, and at the instant that you wake up, you come out of sleep. At that exact instant, what are you thinking? Like, you're almost not thinking about anything. your brain is on a subconscious level starting to activate, right? To come out of that subconscious dream state. And the rabbis sort of pinpointed this as a transitional moment. The rabbis were fascinated by all sorts of kind of in between spaces, and they considered sleep, because they didn't really understand human physiology. They thought of sleep as something like 1/60th of death. They thought in base 60 a lot. So 1/60th is sort of like 1/100th. It's like 1% of death. It would be how to translate that. So if that's the case, if this is like a little bit a taste of what it's like to be dead, waking up is actually a really big deal. The conceit is that our souls depart from us briefly. That's why we go unconscious, and they come back. And so the very first bit of liturgy is Modeh Ani, which literally means I'm grateful. Modeh Ani if you are male identified, Moda Ani if you are female identified. Modeh Ani lefanecha melchai v'kayam, shehechazarta bi nishmati b'chamla raba emunatecha. So I'm grateful. The first thing we think when we wake up, at least according to this, ought to be thanks for restoring my soul. From there, we sort of trace an outline of a pious but observant person going about the beginning of their day. So there's a lot of blessings in here, some of which, many of which we don't necessarily say as part of the synagogue service, but are included here in a Siddur for reference. You'll get blessings about hand washing, for entering the sanctuary. You'll get blessings for putting on your talit and your tefillin. That was, in the sort of concept when these were formed, that would be the first thing you would do. So we put them up front because that's part of how we prepare to pray as well. And I identified here, and you'll see my column contents. I've sort of called each of these by their name, but I put name in scare quotes because sometimes when we talk about these, we call them by a specific name, and sometimes we don't, and I just sort of gave them an English name. And then content, I tried to sort of summarize what's this bit about. So after Modeh Ani, like that moment when we wake up and our souls are restored to us, some of the first stuff we do has to do with our body. We're putting on talis and tefillin. We go from kind of the spiritual to the realm of the physical. Adon Olam appears here, which is probably a familiar hymn. We're turning on to page 6 if you're following along the Siddur. You'll see Adon Olam there. A very familiar hymn, usually to close Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat services. Inserted here as a devotional text. And quite interestingly, too, blessings for Torah study, at least as it's presented here. And again, different variations and sort of how this is arranged between different Siddurim. At the bottom of page 6, we see 6 and 7. We're grateful for the gift of your Torah, and we have the blessing La'asok b'divrei Torah for the study of Torah, which is followed, of course. Remember, we talked about mitzvot that are. Blessings that are for a mitzvah, and the principle of immediacy. You say the blessing and then immediately do the mitzvah. Blessed for Torah study, you got to immediately study some Torah. So it has some blessings, some passages from Torah from which to choose. Also passage from Mishnah, from Gemara, to supplement that with some learning from rabbinic texts. I think it's pretty notable here. There's not too much to say about this other than it really highlights the emphasis on study as a daily practice. Like almost one of the first things the Siddur suggests we're supposed to do is to wake up and learn something. And learn something that we've learned before. Like it's not like we're picking something at random. Learn something familiar, but lay eyes on it again, study it again, learn it again every day. Okay. From there, we move into the portion that gives this this rubric its name, the Birkot HaShachar, the morning blessings themselves. So I'm on the page 1011 spread in Sim Shalom. In here we have this series of brief blessings that really concern daily activities. This is really the core of this section. It's the piece that gives it its name. Some of these blessings have origins in sayings that are found in the Talmud or in the Tosefta. Others seem to be really kind of reactions of blessing to the normal routine of getting up out of bed. So, without going through too much detail, just to point out a few highlights, and kind of imagining you're saying this as you get out of bed. What's the first thing you open your eyes and notice in the morning? It's light out. It's not dark. It was dark when I went to bed. It's light out now. So the first thing blessed for, praised are you, God, who enables creatures to distinguish between day and night. A few more kind of fundamental creative acts make me in the divine image, has made me a Jew, who's made me free, not a slave. And then I think the next section, beginning at Pokeach Ivrim, giving sight to the blind, here you can really see the kind of getting out of bed, getting dressed, giving sight to the blind. I'm opening my eyes, clothing the naked, I'm getting dressed, releasing the bound, I'm sort of stretching my body out, right? Raising the downtrodden, I'm getting up out of bed, all this kind of thing. So providing for daily needs, all this kind of stuff, and really getting ready to start the day. And I think it's really neat how it ends with Hanotein Li'ya'ef Koach, which they translate here as restore vigor to the weary. I'm sleepy, but by sleeping, I'm tired, but by virtue of sleeping, I have renewed strength for the day. Okay. You have a question, please?
Oh, no, I was just thinking, okay, it's in the Orthodox one that has not a woman.
Good. So I'm not going to go down on too much of an excursion here.
I see yes, it's not here.
Yes.
So the substitute here is made in his image, right?
Right. So yeah, and you'll see even more radical changes to this section in other Siddurim. Like if you look at the Kol Neshama reconstruction of Siddur, you'll see some other changes. I mean, like I said, the further we get away from the core, the more kind of liberty there is to change these. But some of these, yes, the Orthodox version says, and they're pretty by our standards, pretty crass. It's thanks for not making me a woman, right? Yeah. Instead of saying thanks for making me free, it's phrased negatively. It's phrased thank you for not making me a slave. Like, things of that nature. Who has not made me, or who has made me a Jew, I think is something like who has not made me an ignoramus, would be a good translation of the traditional version of this. Yeah, like I said, pretty crass by our standards. Still present in the OU Koran edition, but the conservative movement has made that change already to a more egalitarian, more
acceptable to have congregation.
And giving an option, She'asani ben Chorin, bat Chorin, so you can change it, according to your own gender identification. So yes, you notice that. Very good. That's, a great illustration of what I'm talking about. The more you see what's out there, the more you realize like what's going on in the book that you have in your hands, and the more you sort of appreciate its decision making. Okay. So these blessings wind up with what's at the bottom of page 10, and continuing on after that, which is sort of another longer unit of blessing, which is actually on prayer itself, blessing for the ability to pray at all. And actually, interestingly, if you turn ahead all the way to, expresses, as Sim Shalom points out here, personal thoughts, awareness of our mortality, great gratitude for the covenant. 2 lines from the top of the Hebrew on 14, or 3 lines from the top of the English, you see a familiar line. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shekuvah Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. So interestingly, the first line of Shema comes here. This was actually, so let's see. This piece about on the gratitude for the ability to pray was actually originally part of the Yom Kippur liturgy, but that got picked up and kind of transplanted here. It was well liked enough that people were, I suppose, like, I want to say this every day, and so added that to the daily liturgy. And the first line of Shema, there are numerous theories about what it's doing here. Some versions have actually even the whole first Ve'ahavta paragraph. One theory that's generally kind of popular, but probably not accurate, is that it was inserted here because religious persecutors would stop by our synagogues at the time when we normally would recite Shema and make sure that we didn't do it. We're persecuted, so we do it early before they showed up to persecute us. Probably didn't actually. That doesn't really make a ton of sense. One other theory is that it was added here to make sure that you recited it in its proper time. If you took too long with this, if you really took your hour prepared to pray, depending on when you start, you might miss your window. There are defined times of day when you get extra merit for saying your prayers on time. Remember, not only are they obligatory, they're bound to certain periods of time. There's a morning prayer, and there's an afternoon prayer, and there's an evening prayer. And if you say your morning prayer outside of the morning, you've kind of lost out a little bit. Just to draw your attention to what I'm talking about, the other source on the source sheet, number 2, from Mishnah Brachot, chapter 1. So this is very nearly the first thing to talk about. Actually, the very first thing they ask is from when we recite the evening Shema. They do that first. Why? Because the Jewish day starts in the evening. But here we're asking, from what time may one recite Shema in the morning? From the time that one can distinguish between blue and white. Remember, they don't have any clocks. So how do you know what time it is? You can use a visual cue in terms of when your eye can resolve the differences between colors, which are I know it has something to do with rods and cones in our eye, right? But we can't do so well in the dark. Any ideas why they picked blue and white?
That's an easy first distinction. Right?
Good. Where would you find blue and white next to each other first thing in the morning?
Your talit.
Very good. In your talit. If you had a string of tchelet, a string of blue in there. Very good. So when you can tell which is your blue string and which are the white ones, you know it's not night anymore, and you can say your morning Shema. That's one theory. And you have to finish it by sunrise. I'm sorry. Rabbi Eliezer says between blue and green. So he makes blue and green, I think, closer than blue and whites. Not sure where you would find green, but I guess his idea is that it's a little bit later in the morning where you can make a more fine resolution. But finish it by sunrise. Rabbi Joshua says until the 3rd hour of the day. They did have, there were ways to measure time, but they didn't, have clocks on them. Why? Because that's the custom of the children of kings to rise at the 3rd hour. In other words, princes sleep late, and if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. We have until then to recite our Shema, because that's when definitely it's time to move on with our day.
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. And last thing, if one recites Shema later, they lose nothing. Why? Because they're like one who reads from the Torah. You still get merit for reading from the Torah. And Shema is just a verse of Torah, but you don't get both the merit of reading Torah and the bonus for saying it on time. You just get merit for reading the Torah. So you don't lose out in their parlance. Okay, Stephanie.
The 3rd hour of the day. Are we talking 3 o'clock in the morning?
We're talking halakhic hours. So we're talking a 12-part division between basically sunrise and sunset, which of course changes according to the time of the season.
Right.
So the length of an hour changes, the length of a halakhic hour changes depending on the season. This is way more complicated than we need to go in here. But if you were concerned about this, Google Zvanim, in other words, times. And websites like Chabad and things like that will calculate for you the appropriate prayer times for saying all your daily prayers based on your latitude and the season of the year.
So is it the 3rd hour from sunrise? Or?
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
That's what I was.
Right. If we take
That's what I
sunrise,
was figuring.
if we take basically sunrise to the light part of the day, from sunrise to sunset, divided into 12, 3 of those hours, which is not necessarily an hour,
Right.
which is 60 minutes.
Yeah.
It may be slightly more or less than that. So onward.
So they do sleep in light.
The princes, yeah, right? by their standards, right?
It made me wonder if my Eliezer also like to sweep at night, so it's like, well.
Maybe so. I read a little bit of looking down his nose at the princes or something like that. Like they're not really serious. They're not working like we are, getting up and anyway.
There
Okay.
are other things to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's a real life of luxury when you can sleep in until 3 hours after daylight. Okay. So blessings, yes. So we completed the morning blessings all the way through Shema. And then there's another section which represents kind of some more study. We have readings from Torah, readings from rabbinic writings. We have, let's see, beginning on, 14, yes, there at the bottom, rabbinic texts on loving kindness. Many more rabbinic texts from Talmud, from the Midrash, some more from Talmud. These are things that basically were pulled out as kind of somebody thought was a key thing, an important thing to study. And I think it again highlights, emphasizes the importance of study. And if you can't devote yourself to intense study daily, which the rabbis recognize not everyone could do, even if they wanted to, like people who got to work, because that's just what they got to do, you've at least minimally fulfilled your obligation to study something. If you do a little bit in the morning, and you can feel like you're kind of on the right foot for the day. Note on page 20 and 21, we have something called Kaddish de-Rabbanan. I'm going to talk in a second about the different kinds of Kaddishes, but this is Kaddish de-Rabbanan, literally means the rabbi's Kaddish. It's recited after study of Torah, rabbinic texts, and it's one of 4. There are 5 total kinds of Kaddishes, one of 4 that show up in the course of the service. We'll go over them in a second. Since we just studied, we have the opportunity to say Kaddish. Remember, all Kaddish is said only in the presence of a minyan, so the assumption is we're doing this communally. If you are reading closely the Aramaic here, you'll notice the section that's added. It's that paragraph translated in English on 21, granting lasting peace to our people, their leaders, teachers, disciples, everyone who engages in the study of Torah. That's the part that's extra here, relative to the more familiar Kaddishes that you know. We'll circle back to Kaddishes in just a second.
Okay, so if you were you were doing this at home, then you wouldn't do the Kaddish.
Correct, because you wouldn't have a minyan.
Yeah, okay.
It's unclear at this point how much of this is really intended for home. I mean, I think that's clearly a part that's not. Like you would bless for Torah study and study, you wouldn't have the opportunity to say Kaddish. It's all been ported into the synagogue service at this point, basically, yeah. Okay, and then the last section, which I can really only identify as transition, because we have a psalm here. Oh, I'm sorry. We got to skip about 30 pages, because this Siddur does something interesting, which is give us a selection of psalms for the day. We'll touch on that in the concluding prayers, because I think more often they're recited at the end of the service. But sometimes some communities do them here up front. So turn ahead 30 pages to page 50. This Siddur decides to plug those daily psalms in here, and you get Psalm number 30. Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, which in a lot of communities is sort of the formal beginning. There are communities that'll start here, like that'll not do Birkot HaShachar. They'll just assume that you did them at home, or folks will do them privately to themselves as they're preparing. This is sort of the formal start of out loud group prayer. So frequently the shots, the Shaliach Tzibor will start here chanting this psalm. I honestly cannot find a great explanation for why anyone thought that this particular psalm should be the one that's here. It's a psalm that's also said upon recovering from a serious illness, which the best I can figure is sort of that just like death is sort of like, or sleep is kind of like death. Maybe there's some aspect of that gratitude that's evoked by Psalm 30 here, but in all the different commentaries and books I read, no one had a great idea about why this one is here. Like I said, it's kind of a compilation somebody thought it was important. And lastly, we come to Kaddish Yatom, what we know is the Mourner's Kaddish. And at this point, I think since we've encountered 2 of the 5 different kinds of Kaddishes, it's important to have a little break to talk about the different kinds of Kaddishes, because we're going to keep coming up with them. Okay, Mourner's Kaddish is here. You're probably saying to yourself, we're going to do that later, right? Mourner's Kaddish is at the end of the service. All the services I've been to almost always end with the Mourner's Kaddish. That is still true. The Kaddish itself has nothing to do with mourning. It merely closed the service, the one at the end, or closed the section by looking ahead to God's ultimate reign of justice. It's not translated here. I think it's translated else. They translate it, but where it appears later in the service, where most people end up saying it. Frequently, if we're being really honest, a lot of times there's not actually a minyan's worth of people here in the synagogue at this point. This is still pretty early. So a lot of times, even if we had a minyan, we wouldn't, even if we wanted to say it, we wouldn't necessarily be able to say it here. But as I've noted before, Kaddishes serve as kind of punctuation throughout the service. Imagine an era when we didn't have written prayer books. How did people kind of keep pace and know when we were going from one section to another? They didn't get to read the headline at the top, like it says on the next page, Pesukei De-Zimrah, we know we're going to something new. They would need some sort of oral cue. So it's a form of kind of oral punctuation. And in terms of the different kinds of Kaddishes and how they work, I've written them out here. They kind of have different levels of stopping power. If you know how to read, know how Torah trope work, it's actually kind of similar to that. The most common with the kind of least amount of stopping power as a punctuation mark is what gets called variously the Chatzi Kaddish, the half Kaddish, or the reader's Kaddish, all different names. It's the shortest one. It has the least stopping power. That's what we have in between Pesukei De-Zimrah, in between Shema and Amidah. Yes, in there. The Kaddish Shalem, which we get later, we'll get it in concluding prayers, and also in between Amidah and Torah. Shalom literally means full. It's the full Kaddish. It's also called Kaddish Tit Kabal, because that's the line that's added relative to the other ones. Tit Kabal, Slow to Home, Ubav Techon, etc., etc. It's also basically a punctuation Kaddish and has it's like the full stop. We're going to take a full break. Kaddish Yatom literally means the orphan Kaddish. Obviously said by someone who is orphan, seems to be the idea, but we usually call it the Mourner's Kaddish. It lacks the Tit Kabal line that Shalem has, but it's also called Kaddish Yehei Shmei Rabbah, because it's got that line in it, that Kaddish doesn't have Yehei Shmei Rabbah. Right. And the Oseh Shalom B'Ramah, the request for peace, not present in Chatzi Kaddish, but it is in these 2. Okay, I know this is a lot. It kind of actually doesn't matter. The only other one we're going to see is this one, the Kaddish Rabbanan, that has the line about the rabbis and the students. And the 5th kind of Kaddish, which we don't see in the Siddur, is what they call Kaddish Lichadata. It's called that because that's part of the edition is early on, and this is the first word of the edition. It's recited after a burial. After you bury a person and turn away, it's a way of sort of making a separation there as well. I've heard also in the Ashkenazi tradition that people recite it after what they call a siyum, when you finish studying a section of something. Like you finished a tractate of Mishnah, or you finished a chapter of Torah, or something like that. You might have a little siyum party, and you recite that Kaddish there too. But mostly it's after a burial. You're very rarely going to come up against that one. Questions about Kaddishes? Okay. They're not as, they're gorgeous. They're just not as, exciting as you think. In prayer, they function a bit like punctuation. They're also in Aramaic. They're the least easy to understand for most folks. Yeah, they're actually in Aramaic as opposed to the Hebrew. One way you can tell, if you look at the Hebrew, there's a lot of words that end in aleph as opposed to hey. Ending in hey is a common Hebrew trait. Ending in aleph is a very common Aramaic traits. Yeah. So, which at one time was the vernacular. It's the language everyone spoke and everyone knew. So it's notable that that's how our transition, our punctuation is in a language that everyone understands, so everyone gets it. Okay. That concludes the large rubric of Birkot HaShachar. Questions on that? I think it's relatively straightforward. I think Pesukei De-Zimrah is going to get a little bit more interesting for us. Yeah, please.
You use the phrase rubric. Would you please define, or word, would you define that?
Yes. It's a word utilized by those cool colored books behind you called My People's Prayer Book, Minhag Ami. It's a way of analyzing units of sections of prayer. So by rubric, I mean it's a deliberately constructed section of prayer. So it has sort of a coherence to it. Yeah. They give a real great explanation in Minhag Ami why they choose that. But I think it's useful as opposed to just calling it a section, because a section doesn't really tell you about why it's like that. But a rubric sort of implies like somebody put this together on purpose. It's a pattern. Yeah. And there are large rubrics. I would call this whole thing of like a sort of large super rubric. There are 7, large but discrete rubrics in it in Shaharit. Each one has, smaller. I labeled them small rubrics here, kind of sub rubrics, right?
Okay.
There's a way to break it down into increasingly small pieces, right?
Okay.
That's what I mean by that. So, Pesukei De-Zimrah. So we're in Sim Shalom on page 54. And before we go on too much, I want to sort of draw your attention to like the pattern here than the content. So sort of scanning your eyes down the column where it says small rubric in Pesukei De-Zimrah. You'll note it sort of has this kind of, they call it a chiasm in biblical studies. There's sort of bookends on either side of a middle section. We have an introduction at the beginning and a conclusion at the end. We have a biblical interlude following that, and we have a biblical interlude sort of counterbalancing it on the opposite side. And it's centered around what I call here the daily Hallel, which we'll get to what that means in a second. This is a really common pattern in like biblical poetry. There'll be some sort of central verse or central idea, kind of a pivot point around which everything rotates. It's called a chiasm because it's like the Greek letter chi, like an X, because you sort of go this way towards the middle point, and then it's a mirror image of itself. That makes sense? Okay. So that's kind of what I mean here when I say the form is kind of the idea here rather than the content. You're not going to see a real clear through line. Like things, if you try to follow the content, things aren't really going to lead into one another with a sort of clear rhetorical purpose. It doesn't feel like it's taking you anywhere specific. It's kind of all over the place. But when you look at it in terms of the content, we have an introductory blessing. We have a bunch of Bible verses. We have, a key core of Bible verses, some more Bible verses kind of balancing that, and then a conclusion on the outside. It creates this nice kind of artistic structure. Does that make sense? Does anyone not see what I'm talking about?
How do you spell this word, chiasm?
Chiasm.
Thank you.
Chiasm.
Is it related to chasm?
I don't think so. What I learned in my biblical studies class is it's from the Greek letter chi.
Yeah.
Which looks like an X.
Which is when you were saying it, that's what I used to try to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah. So like if you know music at all, it's something like A, B, C, B, A as a musical form, if that kind of makes sense. That's a chiasm. We have the same thing here, there, and it's around the central pivot point. Yeah? Okay.
Okay.
Word of the day is chiasm. Okay. Good. So noting the structure. the very first thing we do is we have as an introductory blessing, very commonly called by its first words, Baruch Shamar, literally, blessed is the one who said. So already you can tell we're using the language of creation and God's speech as a creative act. Personal note, this is one of my very favorite pieces of liturgy. I just really like this one. I think it's mostly the present tense verbs. After Baruch Shamar, which is past tense, you get Baruch Oseh Bereshit, not the one who did creation, the one who does creation. Baruch Omer Veroseh, not the one who said and did, the one who says and does in the present tense, right? I really like that. I think it's clever and creative. But notably, it's poetic. It's a poetic introduction. It's not a formal blessing itself. Those first 5 lines as it appears in Sim Shalom is Baruch Shamar, and it doesn't have that rabbinic blessing formula, Baruch Adonai, da 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 da. But it proclaims God's praise in terms of God's role as creator of the world in a real ongoing way. So we got this kind of poetic introduction, followed immediately by a blessing before biblical passages, which is the second paragraph in the Hebrew on 54, same on 55 in the English. For the same reason that we needed a blessing before Torah study before, we introduced more biblical passages with a blessing that has that familiar Baruch Adonai, Melech Mehulal B'Tishbachot, who's extolled with songs of praise, like very clearly a reference to the upcoming theme, that these are all songs and verses. These are literally Pesukei De-Zimrah. These are verses of song and praise. This is the blessing to set up what's coming next. Make sense?
So
Okay.
all of them then are song and praise. What follows? Although I see Exodus.
Yeah. So basically,
and then
from here on out, it's basically all biblical material.
Okay.
So much of it is Psalms, but not all of it. A lot of it is verses from other places, some from Torah, some from prophets' writings, all over the place. It's this big compilation, but it's basically all biblical verses until the end. There's a reason it's called Pesukei.
The verses are all in terms of praise.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate, or at least for the purpose of praise.
Okay.
You could get a sense from the content that they have a little bit different character, but they're definitely it's all praise. Okay. So jumping into the biblical passages, and we definitely don't need to go on a micro level through here. You can kind of paw through it as you like. We have a compilation of actually the first section from 1 Chronicles, chapter 16. This is the section. This is where David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Zion, which is Jerusalem, and this is the words that David says in praise of God. So we're kind of starting out by borrowing David's language. We continue from there. There's various verses from the Psalm. They're not labeled individually in this book. Another advantage of the Quran is it has a nice little running commentary in the side column that tells you where all these verses are from, so you can look them up. Because every now and then they tweak a little something from a verse in its context to make it fit here, and that can sometimes be interesting too, but it's really hard to look it up this way. So basically just big compilations of verses, but they're all generally speaking on the themes of God's mercy, God's protection of Israel, using only verses taken from various places in Psalms. They sort of make a compilation, like a sequence that becomes actually a dialogue in between God and Israel, which I think is a really clever construction, but the kind of thing that otherwise gets passed over. It's sort of something like, I don't know if there's a good equivalent, a way of sort of like, if you have a favorite poet or a favorite artist kind of making a mashup of their work as a bit of a tribute, like I think it's kind of like that. They've taken all these little bits to create something new and original, but using familiar verses. Let's see, on page 60, we get Psalm 100, which is
so it says it's omitted.
on Shabbat and
Shabbat
festivals.
and the day before Passover.
Yep.
and the day
We will
before
get to that when we talk about the liturgy of Shabbat. You will note, actually, we're going to take another big jump here, because, like it says about halfway down, on ordinary weekdays, we continue with Yehi Kavod on page 80. This book is designed to be used on both weekdays and Shabbat. So we got to turn ahead all the way to 80. This is all, that's skipping over stuff that's Shabbat and holiday only.
Do you have memorized all the page turns?
No,
No, okay.
not.
So you-
One of the things about being a pluralistic rabbi is I dive in with a different Siddur all the time, so I haven't memorized it. There's some that I think I probably know. But also, we only use this one on Wednesday mornings. We use this for the weekdays. On Shabbat, we use what a lot of people call the Slim Shalom, because it's skinnier and it's just for holidays. I didn't make that up. Okay. But if you know what people are talking about now, if you hear about Slim Shalom. Okay. Page 80, more verses on God's kingship, another kind of compilation paragraph made up of lots of different pieces. And we finally reach the core, like the core of Pesukei De-Zimrah, which I call in my notes here the daily Hallel. So we're going to talk about Hallel as its own session. It'll be the last one in this course. So when we say Hallel, we're usually thinking of Psalms 113 to 118, which are recited on holidays. That's the subject of session 7, like I said. But literally, Hallel can mean any sort of set of psalms of praise. And so these 6 psalms, 145 through 150, form their own Hallel of sorts because they're all psalms of praise. Psalm 145 is definitely the most famous. It's the one we call Ashrei, although notably the Ashrei verses are introductions to Psalm 145. They pull it from Psalm 84, and then Psalm 144 is sort of the last verse of Psalm 144 that they use as an introduction to 145. Don't worry too hard about this.
Good.
Psalm 145, though, we call it Ashrei, and it's that alphabetic acrostic. If you read down the column, you got Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Tet, all the way down. Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samach, Ayin, Pei, Tzedek, Kuf, Resh, Shin, Tam. It's called Ashrei. It's about happiness, and it appears later again in Shaharit. This was a rabbinic favorite, it would appear. And then from there, we read the last 5 books of the Book of Psalms. Notably, all literally songs of praise. They all start with Hallelujah, which literally means, like, it's become its own English word, but it is a Hebrew word. Hallel means to praise. Yah is the name for God. It literally means praise God. So they all start with Hallelujah. They have Hallelujah throughout. It's Hallelujah, 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 all the way through until the end of 88. And so it should be a fairly familiar unit. One theory about why these 6 psalms, they may have been chosen deliberately to symbolize an ancient practice of reading the entire book of Psalms daily. There seems to be a rabbinic tradition that they thought that was a really good idea, and like the really best, most pious people would read all of Psalms daily. That is a lot. So by reading the last 6, we finish the Psalms every day. Seems to be the idea. They also, like I said, form their own unit, all beginning and ending with Hallelujah. Okay, so that's kind of the core. That's the C. That's the middle of the X, right? Because past that, we're back into another biblical interlude, and I'm going to go quickly through this part because we're running a little bit long, and I want to make sure to get to the concluding section. We got a bunch more verses, all beginning with Baruch, which serve as an introduction to some material from Chronicles, which is, again, David's words, King David's words, blessing God from there. Verse from Nehemiah, chapter 9, which kind of rehearses the history of Israel, all the way up until the point where they're rescued from Pharaoh's army at the Sea of Reeds, which makes great sense because what comes next, it's the Song of the Sea. I'm on page 92. Yeah, begins on 92. The Song of the Sea, one of the some very very old biblical material, but it's purports to be the song that actually Moses and the people of Israel sang after they crossed. Follow that up with more kingship verses. Like I said, like we're sort of jumping around. We've had kingship as a theme multiple times, but there's no kind of through line here. We get some more verses about kingship, wrapping up on 94. And then we're at the end. We had a blessing at the beginning. We're going to conclude with a blessing. Another familiar one, because this is another one of those sort of cues that we're transitioning. The nusach here, the melody that the person who sings changes at this point. Yishtabach acts as a blessing following these biblical passages, just like we bless before and after Torah reading. And Chatzi Kaddish, like I said, kind of an oral punctuation. It's the shortest one, lets people know we're transitioning into a new rubric. So, questions about Pesukei De-Zimrah?
So why sometimes, you were talking about the degree of stopping power of these different Kaddishes.
Yeah.
Why? I get it at the end. The last one that you're doing after a burial, that's a full stop. We are done now.
Yeah, that one doesn't.
Half and full, for instance.
Well, the burial one doesn't come up as part of the Siddur.
Right.
So I don't think I can really call that one a punctuation Kaddish in the sense that the others are. Why did they choose to stop more fully in one place and not another? I don't know. I think that's one of those things that is kind of lost to that era of orality that we don't have anymore.
Okay.
I don't have a great answer for you other than that seems to be our prevailing idea about why. How does that
Part
work?
of the degree of stopping power is they're shorter versus longer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, basically. I think probably their title. I mean, Chatzi Kaddish, the half Kaddish, isn't literally half the size of Kaddish Shalem. So I think there's probably, the fact that that's what we call it indicates their relative importance to some degree, but I don't have a great answer for you on why certain Kaddishes are in certain places and why stopping in those places matters. Because I don't think it's more of like a rhetorical stop than in a literal one, if that makes sense. Like we don't actually stop there. We go on to the next thing. But in terms of we're sort of telegraphing the kind of the difference between what came before and after more than really stopping, right? We're saying that this is a bigger jump somehow.
It's the close of this section.
Yeah, right. But and closing a section with Kaddish Shalem versus Chatzi Kaddish, I think is trying to say there's a bigger difference between what came before and what comes after than there would be if I had only stopped at Chatzi Kaddish. That's my best guess. I wouldn't really read too much into that. Okay. So let's get on to the concluding prayers. You can flip to the back side of your rubric outlines for the outline I made of the concluding prayers. And if you're following along at home, you're going to want to jump as far as it's called concluding prayers on Sefaria, but we're in the Ashrei, the Psalm 145 that begins the conclusion after the service. Take a look at that 7-part sort of rubric structure. I've been drawing it in this pattern the whole time, which was not my idea. That was suggested to me, but I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of a gradual kind of spiritual lifting up until the point where we're almost kind of reenacting the revelatory Sinai moment. Like we rehearse pieces of our history through all of this, leading up to Torah and Revelation and Sinai. Why don't we just end it there? Like, what would that be like, do you think? What if we just sort of got to the peak, read the Torah, and left?
It seems like it's sealing the practice and sort of recognizing the value of the practice and letting things sink in and integrate.
Okay, that last part was the kind of along the lines of what I was thinking, but I think it's really interesting what you said. Kind of remind me the first part, the
Sealing the practice.
sealing it. Yeah, I mean, you could tell the rabbis are clearly concerned about kind of bookend forms, and like it feels like we kind of need something on that end, right, to create a sense of balance. But I think what you said is right, sort of letting it sink in a little bit. I don't know why they chose to include concluding prayers. I think it's just an interesting thing to kind of conceptualize and think about. They're feeling that we needed a cool down, which again kind of tracks with our concept of prayer as practice. Like athletes have cool down periods. I'm not sure musicians do. Can you just?
Well, I guess
you go get a beer at the bar, and
you wind up resolving if you're doing a music or whatever. Then you resolve the chord.
Good.
You complete it instead of leaving you hanging.
Good. Yeah. I mean, I think that has to be what's going on. It's just interesting to think about that. The Torah is not the resolution somehow.
Yeah.
Like there's something after revelation that's necessary, right? So, yeah. What do you think?
I was just thinking of the analogy of having the most honored and distinguished dinner guest.
Okay.
Right? You show up, you get ready, you schmooze a little bit beforehand, you
Sure.
have appetizers, then you sit down and you have the big meal. That's kind of the big thing. And then there's kind of like, you don't just eat the big meal and then everyone leaves. It's like, all right, you had your turkey, get out.
Gotta have an aperitif, right? Yeah.
Gotta sit and say how great it was that we had this time. So
I think that's another pretty good theory too. Like, we have in other places that not only did the pious ones of old spend a bunch of time preparing to pray, they spend time afterwards meditating and kind of reflecting on the process and where they had been and what they had accomplished. So I think that's kind of what happens here. We're not able to just kind of leave it at the peak. But the rubric is quite short.
I think the meal analogy is a nice one.
Yeah.
You sit and digest for a little while before you go back to ordinary activities.
Yeah. Cool. I might change my terminology on some of this. These are digesting prayers, or small rubric as it should be called digestion. I really like it. I think these are all really great ideas. So it's short compared to the kind of the really overwhelming bulk of Pesukei De-Zimrah and Birkot HaShachar, right? Like it's really interesting that there hasn't been that much added to the after portion. I think there's also a kind of feeling of we've been at this for a while. Like we're also kind of ready to be done here and move on with our day. But we see some kind of reprised familiar elements. Like I said, Ashrei, Psalm 145 makes an appearance again. So I'm on page 152 now. If you're following along in your Sim Shalom, 152. It says concluding the weekday service. We got Ashrei again, a rabbinic favorite. The best I can figure is it's again kind of a meditation. It's making a bookend with the Ashrei that we had previously. We have Psalm number 20, which is a psalm all about, I'm on 154. It's about protection from harm, which I think kind of tracks with the idea of we're going out from here into the world. We want to carry a bit of this with us. Following that, a section called Kaddish De-Sidrah, which I had a classmate in Hebrew college who loved this portion. It's also frequently the portion that gets cut short the most, because frequently it's time for class at this point, or it's time for work, or whatever it is, and this is the part that gets rushed a little bit. So he would always try to make space to do Kaddish De-Sidrah. So it's an Aramaic name for, again, an Aramaic portion. It's literally the Kedusha of the scriptural portion. So Kedusha, you might remember, was the third blessing in the Amidah. When we do it all out loud together, the reader's repetition, we do that in the Kaddish. It's the sort of expanded poetic version of the blessing for God's holiness. So Kedusha means holiness, sanctification, something like that. And it includes another repetition of the biblical verses that appear there during the Kedusha in the Amidah. But, interestingly, they're in Aramaic this time. They're not in Hebrew. Again, this would have been in the vernacular. This would have, as if, literally this would be, the way we could do this more authentically would be to say this in English, which I've tried, honestly, and it's deeply weird. Seriously, we did a service one time, me and a bunch of conservative rabbinic students studying together in Israel, where we davened just like we normally do, except we did it from the English side of the page. We did it with the same chant rhythm, the same thing where like everyone mumbles to themselves, and then the leader comes in with the last verse. We did that, but with the English side, it was really weird and like very enlightening at the same time. I'm not sure I'd recommend it, but like you get the idea. Like there's something about praying in the language that's your native tongue that you fully like absorb and internalize, that it works on a different level. So Kaddish De-Zimrah here is in Aramaic primarily, or at least those verses are. It's a prayer for the establishment of God's kingdom. You'll get that theme a lot in this concluding section. It's definitely different from the rest of the Siddur. Like this is really a different animal altogether. It takes the verses from the Kaddish, or from the Kedusha, but it has no rabbinic blessing formula. There's no formal prayer structure. There's no appeal to God at all. The terminology is very different from the rest of it. It's a very interesting composition. We have a Kaddish Shalem, a full stop Kaddish, as it were. And again, I don't really know why here. Is Kaddish De-Zimrah that different from Aleinu? Like, honestly, no. There's actually a bunch about God's kingship in Aleinu as well. So it's entirely possible this sort of metaphor of stopping power doesn't work as well. It doesn't work as well as we might think, but that's what we got. We got a Kaddish Shalem here. Very familiar prayer, Aleinu. Something you might not know, Aleinu was originally composed as an introduction to blowing the shofar, the shofar service on Rosh Hashanah. We do it there, and it feels out of place when we do it on Rosh Hashanah. You're like, what is Aleinu doing here? That's where it started. People loved it so much they brought it into the daily service every day. It's got two paragraphs, which were actually composed at different times. The first one is older. The Aleinu L'Shabeach paragraph is older, and it's a declaration. It's sort of a doctrinal statement of Jewish belief. It's a declaration. I think of I don't know. I wrote the Jewish concept of God, but I don't think that's accurate. It's a declaration of a Jewish concept of God, and it's pretty powerful. We rise to our duty to praise the Lord of all, who has not made us like other people. We are unique. There's chosenness language here. We bend the knee and bow and acknowledge God, the King of Kings, the Holy One of blessing, who spread out the heavens. Like it's a powerful statement. It's also very clearly not a prayer. There's no address to God here. This is totally, this is us kind of self-talking to ourselves. But it's followed by the second paragraph that is very much a prayer. It's very much addressed to God in the second person. The theme of God's kingship over the whole world, again, stressing that our hope that in the future, all the nations of the earth will also recognize God's kingship, and will sort of bring about a messianic, era of God's kingdom on earth. Yeah, please. I can always tell from the inhale of breath that someone's about to ask a question. Go for it.
Could the Kaddish Shalem be basically saying this is the stop of the whole service, and we're coming to just this last little bit? But the Aleinu is very different from what has gone before.
I think it would be a really interesting essay that if you were to write, I would totally read, where you found all the different Kaddishes in the service and the different kinds and looked at the patterns of what comes before and after and tried to make an analysis of what is this Kaddish trying to do in the flow of the service. I think that would be a fascinating essay. And I really have no idea what the result would be. So is it possible? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you were saying you didn't know why it was there. And
Yeah.
so I was wondering,
You mean why the feeling of a
why
need for
that
a break here?
particular Kaddish shows up there. And so I was wondering, is it basically saying we are through with the whole service per se of the focus
except
of what the service
for Aleinu
and Aleinu is very different from what the kinds of things that have gone before.
I think that's a good theory, that it really calls attention, especially because it's very immediately bracketed by another Kaddish, Kaddish Tov at the end. It really sets Aleinu apart from the rest. That is definitely true. So I think maybe that's right. I think there's probably some.
Actually, then I
some
did it
critical.
the wrong way, not Kaddish Shalem. It was the
Kaddish Shalem first, then Aleinu, and then Kaddish Tov.
The thing that's a little striking about the Aleinu is it's like, because it's so close to the end, it's like, okay, here's our last communal statement before we disperse and go out into the world again.
Yeah, I can see why this got picked up from the Rosh Hashanah liturgy. Like it's pretty compelling. In some ways a little bit problematic, depending on what you think about the Messianic era and Jewish chosenness, and different people have different opinions about that.
I was at a retreat last year, and people were like saying, well, I would never say Aleinu. It's like, isn't it interesting that they included Aleinu in the service? What is this big mystery? Now I do. I think it was the bend and knee and bow that they were having to acknowledging the King's Kingdom. They were having the most trouble with.
So actually, I remember having this conversation with a rabbi who was a teacher of mine in school, and I was telling him how I was at the time more uncomfortable with the second paragraph than the first, and how I was like, I don't necessarily think that like what's going to bring about world peace or whatever, some sort of messianic era is everyone figuring out that the Jews are the best and we had it right all along and that's what needs to happen. Like I don't necessarily think that, which is a little bit of a sort of cynical way of reading this. But he was like, based on a conversation, he sort of convinced me that actually what I had the problem with was the first one, and that it's that idea of God. Like if that's the case, like then why am I okay with, like for us, like our duty is to bow and submit to this. Like that's not really what I'm about either. And he sort of convinced me like these are both sort of problematic in different ways. I think what's also interesting is different prayer books make different choices about how to arrange this. If you check out the Reconstructionist Siddur, they significantly abridge that first paragraph and change it a bit. It starts out Aleinu Shabbat Adon Hakol Tegila Leotzer Reshit, and then it goes Shenatan Lanu Torah Temet, who gave us a Torah of truth, and like reframes it to be a statement about Torah. I think they may also include the traditional wind in there as an option, but they have a rewritten one that's the more go-to one. Interestingly, the Reform Siddur keeps this entirely, but I think leaves out this and may include the second paragraph, but no one ever says it. They just sort of skip to the end. They make different choices about whether to change it or to cut it or what. It's an interesting kind of battleground is not the right word, but people making different choices over this kind of contentious little bit. So worth grappling with for yourself. Like I can't really tell you what to do here.
Well, I don't know. I think it's interesting that when you read it very I mean, it seems like it's a very metaphorical statement about the King of Kings. It's like, what's our final authority going to be? It's not going to be the local political mayor or the president. It's like this. This is the authority to whom we are going to look. I mean, so I think that's the metaphor that they use.
Which I can see being really important to say and affirm.
In their historic
absolutely.
context. And so, I don't know why.
One other thing
a huge problem with it. But,
that's fair. That's fair. One other thing I should point out that even actually this version is slightly abridged from the edited from the original. There's a line right after the part about not making our lot like the other people. There's a line, even in my Orthodox Koran Siddur, it's put in parentheses. It's still in there, but it's parenthetical. It basically says, because their gods they pray to emptiness and vanity. Their God, it's like hitting it right on the nose. They have the wrong religion. Whatever they're praying to is not really God. They're praying to emptiness and vanity. I think that was a little bit of self-censorship and sort of like, what if they got a hold of this book? What are they going to think?
But again, I think you can see that metaphorically as well. It's like, if you think of
and it's notably not in here.
The other God being money and fame and power. That is.
I think that's a very effective way to make this usable in a modern setting. I think in its historical context, it was definitely literal, and they were definitely talking about the Christians. They were definitely talking about their oppressors. It's hard to be too bent out of shape over this. I think that's probably accurate. I can understand why that at a certain point became embarrassing and not something we wanted anymore.
Was it the Christians
and that it did not.
At the time they were writing.
The Christians or the Muslims?
No, the Romans.
Oh, the Romans.
The oppressors. Those oppressors.
That's a good question. I want to say Christians, but I don't actually remember off the top of my head our best guess for dating Aleinu. I'm sure we can look that up. Let's look it up after this. Okay.
Yeah,
one more question? I was just going to move towards concluding because we're on.
Go on.
Okay. Last thing. So Aleinu, we got that. I mentioned earlier, we skipped over that big section that was all those daily psalms. This is the more common place, I would say, that the most Siddurim put that content. The Siddur puts it up front. One reason I think that a congregation might choose to do it earlier rather than later is you got to end with Kaddish Yatom. So if you do Aleinu and then Psalm of the Day. Oh, there's sometimes it works out that you do Aleinu and then Kaddish Yatom and then the Psalm of the Day, but then you got to do Kaddish Yatom again, so you can end on it. And you end up doing it twice, and that's strange. It does. Don't worry about it. Different customs in different places. Some congregations do it at the beginning. Some do it here. If you do want to go back and check out that stuff, you'll note there are 7 psalms corresponding to the day of the week, Sunday through Shabbat. There are also psalms corresponding to the season. So there's one for Elul and the season of repentance. There's one for when it's Rosh Chodesh, things of that nature. It's a practice actually dating back to the temple. There would have been a psalm of the day that would have been recited on a day-to-day basis in the temple. And that's reflected again here. And we conclude with Mourner's Kaddish. Again, kind of making a bookend. We had a Mourner's Kaddish at the tail end of Birkot HaShachar. We have another one here that closes out the service. And I think that's become, this is actually, I think, I believe the original location of Kaddish, like where it was composed and inserted in the first place. I think it's become one of the more kind of identifying characteristics of Jewish worship is that we end with a memorial, right? It's always close to the end. And with that, we've made a full survey of weekday morning Shacharites. Like I've been saying all along, this is kind of the baseline against which we're going to compare other services. Next week, we'll talk about Mincha, the afternoon, and Mariv, the evening. we'll be able to get through those pretty quickly because we already know Amidah. Like that's a bulk of what's going on there.
Not next week.
I'm sorry, 2 weeks from now. We're going to take off for Thanksgiving. If you really want to review activity in the meantime, I would say, very much in line with my Hebrew teacher who made us chart out Hebrew verb after Hebrew verb after Hebrew verb, try making yourself a chart. Kind of sketch for memory what the pieces here, or just try writing them out. I can tell you from my, personally, me doing this work of charting this all out, I have like almost a kind of visual representation in my mind now of how this goes. I feel like I have a bit of command over it. So if you're really trying to internalize this stuff, it's a good idea. This is not mandatory. Anyway, I think you'll be just fine coming back in a couple of weeks to talk about Mendecha and Mariv. But I think just, I want to note that the effort of charting feels worth it for me in terms of improving my own mastery and command over this kind of stuff. So that's Shaharit. Great job. You've made it through most everything important already. We have more to talk about, but now we're getting to the level starting to appreciate the differences. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks everyone watching. See you next time.